Hi everyone, it's Stephen here. I just wanted to mention at the beginning that we recorded this episode shortly before Joe Biden decided to step down from the US presidential race. But we decided to leave in some discussion about the kind of contrast between him and Donald Trump because we felt it was revealing about the kind of role of masculinity in politics. So yeah, we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hi everyone, it's Sandy Ruxton here. Welcome to Now and Men, the podcast on men, masculinities and gender equality. So there's lots going on in the UK, Stephen, since you've arrived. How's your trip?
Yeah, good, thanks, Sandy. Yeah, hi, everybody. Yes, I'm actually back in the UK currently, just visiting. I was also here for a conference for the British Society of Criminology. And it's lovely being back, seeing friends and family, and, well, I guess it represents how the podcast is kind of across multiple continents, and that's a bit like how my life is going at the moment. But this is actually the first time that we're recording the podcast together in person, isn't it? Well,
it is.
In this format, at least.
Yes, we're very close today.
We're sitting very close to each other, so hopefully it all goes okay, and we don't trip over each other in any way. But yeah.
So we're delighted to welcome Jeff Hearn to Now and Men today. Jeff will be known to many of you, and it's very hard to know where to start in introducing his extraordinary career. He spent his early career, I think it was about 21 years, was it, Jeff, at Bradford University in the UK, and then he's held recent posts.
I suppose in terms of academic work, I think I was I think 21 years. Yeah, that wasn't my first job, so-called job, but that's right. I lived.
Yeah, but I'm not sure I can go through all your jobs.
Sorry?
So if I go through all of your jobs, we'll never get to the end of it because you've had quite
I
a
worked
few.
Before that as well, I should make clear. I actually did work, before I was employed before Bradford.
Okay, well, more recently anyway, you've been in Finland and you've been Professor Emeritus of Management and Organisation at Hanken School of Economics and also Senior Professor of Human Geography at Örebro University in Sweden. And you're still Professor of Sociology at University of Huddersfield in the UK.
Well, it's really hard to know, Jeff, how to describe your very wide-ranging body of work. I think the research area he's perhaps most well known for, and certainly most relevant to us, is in the field of critical studies on men and masculinities. And he's also worked extensively on organisations, management and work, with particular emphasis on gender, sexuality, diversity and intersectionality, but also research around men's violence to women and children. And his wider interests include globalisation and transnationalism, social theory, and the sociology of culture.
And now, in today's episode, we'll explore just some aspects of your work, Jeff, if that's okay. But it does mean missing out quite a lot. So if you're willing, maybe we'll ask you back at another time. But
well, you may regret that statement. You may want to retract that, immediately in 15 minutes' time or something.
Well, we're going to give it a go and see how far we get anyway. But
actually, I want to say one thing. It's interesting how you talk about all this work stuff, all this university stuff. There's also another side which is about personal and activism and so on, actually. But we'll come back to that, maybe.
We'll come back to
absolutely,
that, yeah.
That's where it started.
Okay. Well, we thought we'd start by asking you a little bit about the turbulent political climate, particularly as it relates to men and masculinities. And, we know you co-wrote an article in 2020, which is in the Conversation, the online journal, about the contrasting masculinities of Biden and Trump, and obviously recent events, all the furore about Biden's presentation and then the potential, the attempted assassination of Trump, have made this all particularly salient, really. So do you want to say a bit more about, the contrasting masculinities that are on display here and how you see masculinity framed and displayed in this contest?
Yeah, well, it's a small question, a big question.
That's a big question, really.
I suppose in a way, I think it's very difficult to talk about what you might call public politics or government politics or party politics without talking about men, actually. People do it all the time, actually. But, it's different if you're talking about social movement politics or personal politics or intimate politics. But if one looks at the sort of so-called global stage, all these pictures of world leaders, you might get one or two women out of 30 or 40 figures, whether it's NATO or whether it's these other summits and so on and so forth. So it's really hard, actually, to disentangle talking about, sort of world leaders, whether it's Biden and Trump or many others we could name, without actually bringing men and masculinities in. It's actually perhaps impossible. So, I mean, talking about the different styles of those two US men, even saying US men sounds a bit strange, if you understand. It sounds a bit awkward, saying that. Naming men as men, as it's been called. And the styles are obviously very different. I mean, you can call these political masculinities, and there's been a big debate about the usefulness of that term, political masculinities, because in a sense, you could say all masculinities are political with a small p. But it's really obvious that certain, leaders, prime ministers, presidents, do adopt, sometimes obviously really consciously, sometimes perhaps a bit less consciously, what you might call, modes or styles of doing masculinity or masculinities. And in the case of, I think it's, it feels like so obvious saying this, in the case of Trump and also, say, Johnson, I mean, they clearly have cultivated a very, you could call it, we'll call it many things, could call it an entertainment style almost, really, or a brash style, or so-called everyman style, which is obviously totally ironic, bearing in mind the background and the riches, etc., of those particular men. So that's a very particular way of presenting, and of course it's been taken up by other leaders, particularly on the right, to be this sort of everyman populist, even if the person themselves is actually totally the opposite. And then, Biden, of course, is a bit of a different character, and, he's a little bit older, not much older, actually, a little bit older than me, and, has, adopted this, or has adopted, rather, this more sort of senior statesman, trust me, I know what I'm doing, or not, in terms of recent events. You could call it, I don't know if you want to sort of make a sort of family reference, grandfatherly or great-grandfatherly, maybe even, perhaps, I don't know. So, I mean, there's such obvious ways of presenting, and when we wrote that was a few years ago in terms of the previous, election battle. I'll use that word deliberately. And of course, things have changed a bit since then for a whole variety of reasons, not least the issue about age, and then what happened a couple of days ago in terms of this assassination, or, probable, I don't know, we don't know to it, probable attempted assassination, which again is particularly ironic. I mean, in terms of the, I think you could say, thinking about Trump, although he has this entertainment side, he's obviously very good at that, good in inverted commas, he's obviously got a lot of other sides. And I mean, Trump's masculinity, if you want to, or masculinities in the plural, are rather complicated because in some ways they're very, very clear-cut, very, very direct, whether you're talking about race or trans or migration or whatever, they're very, dare I say, black and white. But at the same time, he's also very slippery, actually, of course, and very flexible, not in a good sense, flexible. And that's been written about by Jim Messersmith and others as well. So he has a sort of fluid masculinity at the same time as being very blunt and rigid. It's a funny combination, and it's not so different from what goes on in, again, to use the word entertainment. Where you get, say, comics who or maybe sometimes comic duos, who actually use this contrast between the sort of the serious and the ridiculous as a source of humour. It's a well-established form of humour. You can think of examples, I'm sure, yourself. I think the other thing to say about this is that this is so much to do, isn't it, with politics online. I mean, so much to do that politics isn't now about Parliament. Well, it is partly, It's not only about Parliament or about sort of, public meetings or, I mean, if you see pictures of, 100 years ago, you get crowds in the street, often a lot of men, actually, in a, say, city square or town square gathering, and it wasn't exactly Greek democracy, but what goes on now is obviously very, very different to that in terms of the creation of clips, or the creation of sort of, 5-second little phrases and so on, and how that then gets reproduced, sometimes benignly, sometimes malevolently. Yeah. But it's very hard, I think, to think. I mean, of course, the latest development in the UK in terms of this new government, I don't know if you want to switch that or not.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a shift here, even in the representation of women in the cabinet. I think it's one of the highest. And then, of course, one could start discussing, if we talk about political masculinities or, different kinds of masculinities and political leadership, how does that relate to different ways in which women do political leadership? And, of course, I would say even in the UK, where you are, I know currently, that is still quite novel, really, despite a few obvious figures, which I won't list this moment. It's much more established, I would say, in some Nordic countries as a kind of phenomenon. You could either call it women's political masculinities, or I'm not sure if it's a good term, women's political femininities. I mean, one could discuss the terminology. But you see what I mean? I mean, there's much more obviousness around that than there is even in the UK, with, I think, the first woman Chancellor of Exchequer appointed just last week. And this is then a million miles away from the sort of Biden-Trump contrast that we've just been talking about briefly.
I mean, the other significant thing here is the backgrounds in terms of education as well. That I think the new cabinet, 4% went to private education, which is an extraordinary change from previous governments. I think it was about 65% or something like that in Sunak's cabinet. So you could argue that they're much closer to people's everyday experiences, if you like, as a result of going through the same education as the vast majority of the population.
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to say a bit more about that, about your reflections on what's been going on across Europe? Because as you said, we've also had these recent elections in France, and, the far right probably haven't done as well there as they were expected. And of course, they are led by a woman, but perhaps, still adopting quite a massive...
That's right. It gets complicated, yeah.
Yeah, but do you have any thoughts on all the kind of turbulence we're going through across Europe at the moment?
Actually, I have quite a lot of thoughts. In one sense, one does have a lot of thoughts. In another sense, I'm a bit cautious, actually, as well. So I'll try and explain that if I can. The way I see it, or at least I think I see it, this moment, is that there's always, a right wing, as there's always a left wing. I mean, that's nothing new. There's also always a far right. Perhaps almost in every country, it might be a relative minority, but it exists. It exists with the different histories as well, of course. If you're talking about, I don't know, Italy, if you say, it's a different history to, say, Sweden, right, where I've actually worked quite a lot, in fact. So one's got to be aware of this kind of context. So there is always some kind of, dare I say, lurking far right, which is more or less developed. And then, of course, the majority of the population, and again, there's fairly established studies that look at, things as straightforward as, voting patterns of men and women vis-a-vis left-right. And there are, in many cases, and there's been research on this, people like Sperling and others, where there's a tendency for more men to vote towards the right. This is nothing automatic, obviously, but you can talk about how some of the values espoused by some right or far right groups fit a bit more closely to some versions of masculinity. But then, of course, that doesn't explain, some of the sort of larger rise of support, amongst the sort of wider population, if that's the way of putting it. I think that's then a bit more complicated, and there's been a number of ways, obviously, of thinking about that, really. One is amongst some people, the sort of giving up on politics, actually doing what they say they will do. I mean, basically, the decrease in believing what politicians say. And then, of course, there are other issues around the specific sort of, so should we say, neglect of services or infrastructure, and particularly amongst people who need that services and infrastructure. And then one goes on to other questions like migration, of course. And I think migration, again, is really complicated in the sense that, you know, there are certain localities that have experienced very difficult situations through very local, heavy migration. And one should actually be aware of that. And the infrastructure perhaps is not there. But then that then can be exploited amongst others who are not actually experiencing that migration directly at all. You know, so sometimes you get, you know, support for the right or the far right, even in areas where there is very high migration, and there's sometimes in areas where actually migration is somewhere else. And then you have this other sort of phenomenon, which I suppose which links back to masculinity more directly, which is around the so-called anti-gender ideology debate, which is very explicit in certain parts of Central and Eastern Europe, a bit more muted, but it's still there in Western Europe, and it's still there, say, in debates around trans, for instance, in the UK. But I mean, in some parts of Europe, there's a very explicit, and in Russia, I mean, explicit articulation of an anti-feminist, anti-LGBT agenda, which, of course, you can then actually link to certain kinds of masculinities, both of those who are promoting it, propounding it, and those who are sort of going along with it, either by voting or because they haven't got much choice. This mixture of forces, many of which are really clearly gendered and classed, and also racialized as well. There's again there's the online issue, you know. So I mean, there's clear evidence of, you know, heavy use and misuse of online information, disinformation, you know, often very gendered, which can go very quickly to, you know, thousands or millions of people. So these things, you know, tend to get reinforced, and the whole thing about, you know, people operating in bubbles or relative bubbles, you know, in terms of algorithms that reproduce what people already click is well established and well studied, I think. So all these things feed into a kind of well, it could be a polarization, or it could be, I was thinking just this morning, actually, in the UK. I mean, I haven't lived in the UK since the late, or at least not fully, since the late 90s. And I mean, now you've got like almost a five-way split, haven't you, going on, actually? You've got Labour, Conservatives, which obviously very established, and then you've got Liberals taking a side of Liberal Democrats, rather, and then you've got Green and Reform as well as Independents. And it's like almost like a five-way star, sort of, you know, not just polarising, not to mention nationalists, and not to mention Northern Ireland. So it's a very, very mixed picture. Anyway, so I think these things are all relevant. I mean, the other thing I wanted to say about caution, I was actually recently asked to write something about Central and Eastern Europe. And actually, I refused to do it. Sounds too worthy. What I mean by that, although I've worked a lot with colleagues in Central and Eastern Europe, a lot, at least in certain parts, I think one needs to be a bit cautious, not always sort of coming out on every topic, because the situations are more complicated and they vary actually a lot. Even I know, I mean, I've worked with a lot of people in the Baltics, Estonia and Latvia particularly, which is different to talking about, should we say, Serbia or, you know, or Poland. I mean, so I think, yeah, I said, you know, there are other people who know more about this, and I think it's important to actually not just transfer what's going on in France or UK or US to what's happening in, say, other parts of Europe or even beyond, of course, obviously, as well. So that's like a word of caution as well.
You did do earlier work, didn't you, with the Chrome network, critical studies on
I did actually,
men.
yeah. That was a really interesting thing.
I mean, that's a few years ago now, but you know, I mean, you had sort of emergent categorisation then of, you know, countries that are developing gender equality strategies, those that have a more specific focus on gender equality and masculinity, and so on and so forth. But I think you're right that you also at that time were saying, yeah, there are differences between and within countries as well that are significant, and it's actually hard to apply a sort of overall categorisation.
Actually, yeah. I mean, I sort of I moved to Finland in the late 90s, and that project began in 2000, so quite shortly after. And it was on European countries and men and masculinities. And actually, one of the basic things came up there was actually the term masculinities was not so useful, actually, because it meant something very different, talking about these things in different parts of Europe. But to come back to the point you made, yeah, I mean, we did try and look at this a bit more semi-systematically. And as I already mentioned, I mean, the situation in the Nordic countries, but even they vary, as well. I mean, but I mean, all of them have had gender equality policies for quite a long time. In Finland, I mean, some of them involving men specifically, in a sort of progressive or more or less progressive way. I mean, Finland, for instance, where I've lived, has had like formal apparatus since, well, sometime in the 80s. I can't remember exactly the year now, maybe mid-80s, 84 or something like that, which is quite a long time. And certainly Sweden and Norway have been and Iceland have been particularly prominent. And that situation is a bit different to some of the countries like Germany or France, or the UK was then in the EU, but not now, obviously. And where gender equality and involving men in that has been much more recent, but has got some kind of apparatus, some kind. And then you have the sort of countries that were at that time were either or attempting to join the EU, and many of them then began putting in such policies, some of which were explicitly about, I mean, they're about gender equality, so to what extent they actually name men vary, but they were sort of beginning that process. I mean, sometimes they had to, basically, in order to join the EU, actually. Of course, one can discuss that. And then there were other countries that were a bit more sort of not on that particular route, or very low, beginning it, like, I don't know, Croatia, for instance, that now has actually joined, I think. Yeah. So we were looking at this in a very broad way. And I mean, this is not original. One can sort of think about Europe, particularly the EU, as a kind of laboratory, almost, of variation around these issues in a very small space, really, which is a bit different talking about. And of course, there's variation between US states, obviously, as well, which also has been studied as well. I think it's been work in the US states in terms of, responses to COVID and different kinds of responses in terms of the political leadership and how that actually has affected COVID deaths in different US states. So again, that's another example. Yeah, but that's one thing which I think is really important, to sort of think beyond the particular locality or country one happens to be in. There's a lot of what is often called methodological nationalism flying around. Sometimes in rather very worrying ways, actually, even when things seem to be progressive. Yeah. Was there a question? I'm not sure. I'm not sure about. Yeah. I should say Chrome. Yeah. It wasn't anything to do with metal. It was critical research on men in Europe, and we had a very long name. I don't know if I can remember it. The social problem and societal problematization of men and masculinities, which was then shortened to the social problem of men, which was a bit ironic, but it was actually trying to make the point. We had this sort of double agenda, which Keith Pringle was particularly involved in, and many others, is that, men, or some men, create problems, but men also some men also experience problems. And this is kind of, it's not trying to be sort of even-handed, but it's making the point that there is to use a flash of a dialectic between some problems that are created by men, an obvious one will be violence, and then some problems that are experienced, not necessarily by the same men, but and the obvious things would be fear of violence from other men is a big issue. or health problems and risk taking, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing we looked at, and how these things varied in different European countries.
Right. Am I right in thinking more recently you've been working a bit more on what you've called violence regimes? Is that right?
Violence regimes. Oh gosh, yeah, that's that's another
a more recent strand of comparative work. No?
Yeah. Well, oh God, how can I? Yeah.
Sorry.
Formally, that project ran for several years, 3 or 4 years, and God, it was trying to look at how different kinds of violence, you could say, relate to each other. Putting it mildly. One can look at this, statistically, so-called correlate with each other. One can look at it in a more sort of broader policy way. One can also look at it more theoretically, which in terms of what on earth is violence, which is a very, very difficult question to answer. I'm not going to try and answer it at this moment anyway. So we look. It's like, to what extent, for instance, if you have, should we say, a militaristic state, right? Just to use a simple example, either in war or preparing for war, does that tend to increase, should we say, violence against women? Or femicide, say. And the short answer is yes, but then of course there are many in between complications. We're looking at, for instance, to what extent different kinds of violence, from very macro to very more interpersonal, tend to go along with each other, you might say. And I say the short answer is yes. But it's much more complex than that. And so we're trying to open up also the idea of violence from not only being about killing people, or even directly physically attacking people, to a broader understanding of violence, which includes what you might call non-physical violence, or even ecological violence. So it's a kind of in one sense, it's a very concrete idea, which is not hard to get, I don't think. It's a fairly simple idea. On the other hand, it's a very open-ended idea as well, actually, that gets one thinking about, is ecological violence violence? Yeah, well, it is, in a different kind. Is colonial, occupation violence? Yes, well, it is, of course. Is domination of knowledge, or, taken for granted, so-called epistemic violence, yeah, that is violent. But it takes you a long way, or quite a long way, from what is often discussed in the media in terms of, specific acts of violence, whether it's coming back to the thing at the beginning, whether it's an assassination attempt, or whether it's, war violence, like in Ukraine or Gaza or somewhere, So that's what it's about. Yeah. That's the idea.
Really interesting.
But actually, it links very closely to other earlier work, which was more directly about interviewing men around violence, particularly violence to women and children. And this was a project mainly in the UK in the 1990s, so it's a long while ago now in one sense, but it was quite I wouldn't say adventurous, but that's the wrong word. It was a kind of fairly novel project at the time, doing that. These were not men in prison, by the way, or at least there were a few, but most of them were in the community, living in the community. And one of the things I remember, at least from those interviews that we did, again with colleagues, was that when men talked about violence, they were often very, very particular and very narrow, actually, in their way of talking about violence. It talked about, it's a terrible analogy, it's almost, they were almost talking about so-called highlights. Do you know what I mean? Like football highlights. That this was a very particular moment when something happened, in inverted commas, meaning he hit somebody, or a woman usually. And then what happened sort of afterwards, or the impact of that, or what happened in between, or the sort of aftermath, or what preceded that, if you follow me, was of much less interest, you see what I mean? So it was very much a way of talking in these interviews by the men who were interviewed about this particular way of looking at, hitting or slapping or whatever, as against thinking about violence as a kind of process that goes on before, during, and after, as well as not only being physical but non-physical, even though the non-physical can have physical effects. Sorry, yeah. And this, in a way, links back to this violence regimes thinking in a more sort of global sense.
Well, I mean, I suppose we've just given a little insight into some of the many different projects, pieces of research you've done over many years of being involved in this work. So I guess we were just interested really in your kind of reflections on your career, you know, the history of your work. I mean, you must have seen huge changes over the time you've been working in this field. And I guess, yeah, what was it that first kind of, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning about activism, for example. Like, what was it that first prompted your interest in this field, and how did that then kind of, you know, deepen and broaden over time?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've said and I've written about this before, actually. I mean, there are different ways of telling these kind of stories, you know. I mean, there are. But the easy way of saying this is in 1978, I can be as precise as that.
Right.
I was working in Bradford University, University of Bradford, in a department that had a very strong feminist presence, I would say, put it that way. And a group of us, or actually initially a friend of mine called Pete Blackett, actually, we thought, well, you know, there's a lot going on here around feminism, around women's groups, and actually it'd be a good idea if we would at least try to form a men's group. And we did that actually in the university initially, and we met for 2 or 3 weeks, or 2 or 3 times rather. But it became apparent pretty quickly that some of the men were coming for different reasons, actually. They were not really all interested in the same thing. So then we reformed it actually in the community in Bradford, in the city itself. And that continued for quite a few years. And that was a kind of personal, political, what was then called anti-sexist. That was the term used then in the late 70s. And there was a lot of, quite a lot of activism around that. There were regional meetings, even national meetings, sort of gatherings. They weren't conferences, they were gatherings with various kinds of workshops and various things. There was the journal Achilles' Heel that was very active then. There was also what was called the Men's Anti-Sexist Newsletter, used to rotate a different editor group every issue, and so on and so forth. And that went on. And then I suppose really what happened, I mean, personally, is that after a few years, and I'm not sure exactly how long it took, I realised that what was going on, like personally and also more activism-wise, was actually very, very closely related to what I was interested in my sort of day job, which was, you know, teaching and research. And, you know, I was researching on patriarchy, for instance, amongst other things, and so on and so forth. So then, after a while, the strands, the so-called personal, political, and the more academic sort of blended with each other. And of course, there are different languages and different ways of talking in different contexts. You know, if you're in a men's group, you don't give people a lecture. You don't do that anyway in university necessarily. But I mean, yeah, there are different sort of terminology even, but I think that's the way I got interested in it. But I've also said that, you know, that one can tell the story in other ways. I mean, I did my undergraduate finals in May '68 when, you know, there was a lot going on politically, and not only about feminism, but around, you know, civil rights and racism issues and so on and so forth. And then another thing I've mentioned is that when I was, you know, in primary school, my best friends were girls, but then at 7, I went from a mixed primary school, as was normal, to a single-sex so-called junior school, and I never saw them again. And actually, I never realised this for about, I don't know, probably about 20 years. This might sound very bizarre, but, you know, that was the normal thing. You went to a mixed primary school, and then you went to a single-sex boys' school, which happened to be in the same road where I lived. So, I mean, one can sort of talk about these things in different layers and different extents. And then, yeah, I think it's sort of jumping back again. I think I started teaching what was a master's course on men and masculinity. I think it was called Men and Masculinity, actually, in the singular, I think, initially. I think it was. Around 1984, as ominous. And I did that initially for students who were doing the master's, the postgraduate degree in what was called social and community work studies, and then the women's studies students who were in the same department, but they were since doing a different course, and then continued since then. Yeah.
I suppose, we were going to ask about any particular kind of high or low points along your journey,
I think one way I put it, I think when one started getting involved in these things in the late 70s, and then I was doing also a PhD as well at the time, and I remember my supervisor saying, well, how can you study men? How can you study men? I said, well, yeah, you can. Doing those things at that time, both in activism and personal politics and academically, was seen as being a bit weird, actually, a bit strange. It's a little bit like the whiteness debate. How can you study whiteness? It's a little bit similar. And I think also some of the debates were a bit more straightforward as well. People seem sometimes then to have a more unidimensional idea of what masculinity was. And of course, Raven Connell's work has been very important in talking about masculinities in the plural, obviously. Mm. But then one's had a whole lot of critiques, either directly on that kind of approach or indirectly. Whether it's, to use the jargon, post-structuralism, postmodernism, decolonial, eco-critiques, etc. So now one's got to know, or at least be aware of all these different approaches, I think, or different ways of thinking, rather than saying this is the one way of understanding, whether it's masculinities, hegemonic masculinity, or whatever. And again, it is linked, of course, to technology. Because, in the old days, in the 70s, you wrote letters to people and you'd wait, a couple of weeks and they might reply or might not. Mm. Whereas now, of course, we're doing what we're doing, and that's both can be misused, as we were talking earlier, and can be also extremely useful for developing friendships and colleagues, contacts and so on. And of course, it's also reflected in activism with organisations like Many Engage Alliance and others, which you could say hardly existed really in those days. So the activism, the sort of global or globalising activism and the globalising research or writing, I think they kind of go together to some extent. Again, generally really, really important ways. And then this also links to the kind of issues that people are working on. And I suppose, well, the thing I've got a bit obsessed by, and not so much now, this minute, but actually partly when I moved to Finland, I got, really interested in this issue of transnational approaches to things, not just things being one place or another country, Britain, France, US, but actually a lot of what goes on is transnational. It's like between or across, or even sort of, not dissolving, that's too strong, but actually somehow going beyond countries, and that can apply to all sorts of things. Migration is an obvious issue, and the environment. The environment doesn't care about boundaries. National borders, obviously, but also it relates to other things. Whether it's sort of things like the European Union is a transnational organisation, or whether you're talking about big business. Most big business, or most business actually, full stop, is transnational. Even small entrepreneurship is often using transnational technologies. But big business, or particularly like global finance, it's totally transnational, really. So those kind of issues, I think, are what are needed to be studied much more by researchers doing critical work on men and masculinities. It's not to sort of say the personal or the local is not important, but unfortunately that's the reality, that these kind of issues, eco issues, finance, migration, war, obviously, these affect millions of people. And somehow we, dare I say, we have got to sort of up our level a bit, I think, and think about, these things. And even though sometimes, access is not so easy, and it's easier to interview a group of 20 young men, in a school or in a neighborhood, than it is to, interview 20 executives, of proper big business, So, this is also a sort of research challenge as well. That's the way I think things kind of should go, but not to neglect the personal as well, of course. The personal is always important. Yeah. The local is always important.
And do you think we do talk to, because obviously we have seen this explosion of this field of critical studies on men and masculinities, and do you think that we do perhaps talk too much about masculinities, because you have written in the past about why it might be useful to focus more on men's practices and maybe the idea of like the hegemony of men rather than hegemonic masculinity?
I do, actually,
Is that something you can still...
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say, not to be argumentative, but I think it's very important to call this a subfield, not a field, actually. It's might sound like nitpicking, but...
Yeah, no, that's a fair...
I see it's very important to me to see it as a subfield within gender studies, queer studies, even decolonial studies more general, or environmental studies, and how they overlap. But going beyond that, I think it's interesting. I've actually written this somewhere, I don't remember where. I think if Raewyn, Raewyn Connell had called her sort of, major work Masculinities, Men and Masculinities, it would have made a difference, I think, actually. Because when people talk about masculinities only, it can be sort of separated from the realities of what is meant by men. And this is, again, rather complicated in the sense that there's an issue about how the category of men is actually developed. And again, it varies in different countries. One very simple example of this, is about age, actually. At what age is somebody counted as a man? Well, if you're a child soldier in some parts of Africa, and you're 11 or 12, well, I don't know. Is that a man? I don't know. Which is very different, in some places, you can't drink alcohol, or not, well, in some places you can't drink alcohol at all, actually, but in some places, 21 or something. So, even the notion of what counts as the category of men, not to forget issues around, trans and non-binary and agender, that's another area, or who is a real man in terms of being able to, qualified to go and fight in war, who is thought to be... Kapana Ratale, a good friend and colleague in South Africa, has written about the usefulness of the categories of non-men and non-masculinity when discussing men and masculinities. And of course, he's discussed that partly in relation to slavery issues and colonialism, but it's also more general. I think a useful thing to go back a bit and think what is behind this term men. And of course, there is a clear relationship to biology and maleness, but it's not quite exactly the same thing. You're male when you're in the womb before birth, and you're male as an infant, a baby, and you're male after you've died, actually. But the category of men is a bit different. It's a social category. Like whiteness is a social category. So I think, and I'm not sure if people have, I don't know if I dare say this, I don't know if I've explained well enough what I mean by the hegemony of men. But what I've tried to mean by it is it's like a double take. So it's partly about being or not being within that category, either as identified by oneself or by other people like the state. So that's like a sort of structural issue. And then there's what men do as practices, as you said. And people tend to neglect the first, but focus on the second. And I would like a bit more work on the first, actually. And it actually does bring together sort of structural issues around the state and capitalism and colonialism with queer theory, actually, in a way that isn't always appreciated.
Can I ask you a little bit about the, going back to the work, you mentioned of men's groups. And you said that in the 70s, late 70s, you're a member of a couple of men's groups. And actually, there are other people we've interviewed who you know very well, like Bob Pease, talked quite a lot about the same the same issues. But I wanted to ask you about the more recent work you've done on memory, and with the older men's memory work group.
Yeah.
Because that seemed quite interesting and quite distinctive in a way. Because I'm not aware of other examples.
Indeed, yeah.
But you produced a book, Men's Stories for a Change, I think it was called, and you had different chapters on, hair, clothes, sport. You've got it in front of you there.
I have,
Food.
yeah.
Even
I did my homework before.
Even peeing was one of your chapter titles.
Exactly, that was very good, yeah.
But what was it like to be a member of that group? That group ran over quite a long time, 13 years or so, I think.
Yeah, well, a bit more than that, actually, yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I'll go back briefly, just very briefly. I say I was involved in this men's group in 1978, and that at the time was very novel, or it felt very novel. To actually sit in a room without an agenda was actually really... What are we here? Are we here to discuss football? No, we're not, actually. Well, we could do, but anyway. And then I was involved in, I don't know exactly, but probably I would say something like 6 or 7 other men's groups. Some were more general, sort of conscious raising. Some were more, there was one on writing, for instance, specifically, one on more therapeutic. And then when I moved to Finland, I was involved in what was then a very active group called Profeministimiehet, which means pro-feminist men. That basically was about demonstrations. It wasn't a particular consciousness-raising group. We actually did things. That's all. We did things. We went, demonstrated and gave out leaflets and various things. But that group you mentioned was, again, as you say, was a bit different. And if I remember this correctly, 3 of us, which were David Jackson, Tony Jefferson and me, had this idea of doing this in about 1993. It took us 10 years to do it, to organise it. Tony didn't actually take part, but David, who has now sadly died, and I think there were 7 of us at the beginning. I think it was around 2002, something like that, we started. And then we met. I think I was the second youngest. And several people were retired, several of the men were retired, and the membership changed as well a bit. Some left and some joined. And despite or because of this, we were all really busy, actually. And so we decided to meet twice a year. And so it was a very particular thing. And I was living in Finland, and so therefore I would organise my trips to the UK to coincide every 5 or 6 months. And we met basically for one day, say twice a year, and we did what is loosely called collective memory work, which is based upon work by, Frege Haug and others in Germany, loosely at least based on that. There are big debates about how you do memory work, actually. And what we did, basically, we decided for each session to write at the same time, separately, like not necessarily in the same building. Sometimes we met in different places. We only met once in someone's home. We met usually in sort of like community centres or that kind of thing. So we met all day, but we actually talked and then decided what we were going to do and write on, and then we wrote for about an hour separately on a particular topic, and usually the topic was also refined. It wasn't just like write about peeing. It was write about I don't know what you feel about peeing, or I don't know, I can't remember now, but it was discussing what actually the topic was very important indeed. And we did this not knowing what we were doing, really. I don't know. And after about meeting twice a year for about 9-10 years, we thought, what should we do? At one point, we thought of doing a play, actually, but then we didn't do that. And then we thought, we should actually, we transcribed, we transferred all the writing, typed it up from handwritten to like an archive. And then we started working on it, and eventually it did become a book. But that wasn't the plan initially. And I think, in a way, what was most interesting, perhaps, was that, as I say, I was the second youngest, and it was a lot about age and well, getting older and about the body. And what we tended to write was either about things that were fairly current or recent, or sometimes things that were quite a long time ago. The middle years were kind of missed out. So sometimes it was like, my first date or something like that. Or it was about, peeing now. I keep using that peeing something. And these bits of writing, they're very different to academic writing. They're very different to sort of confessional writing. I mean, one of the great things about memory work is that when you write things down and you do it separately, you can then do lots of things with it. You can discuss how the different writing is very similar or very different. So you become both like a subject and an object at the same time. Mm-hmm. And it was very intimate, and it involved also a lot of very, very close trust to write about things that perhaps men don't usually talk about or write about so directly. I don't know if this conveys at all.
No, it does. I think it's very interesting. I mean, I don't know of any other groups that have undertaken work precisely of the same kind, to be honest. I mean, in a way, you're opening up the issues around ageing and masculinity, which haven't had as much sort of airtime or research interest, I think, and that seems to be an expanding field these days. So, I think this is good.
Yeah, absolutely. This is good. I mean, yeah, it's a very important area. Well, in some ways, age around men and masculinity it's very contradictory. I mean, in some ways you sort of get some kind of authority. I mean, back to Biden and possibly Trump. In other ways, yeah, you lose. I mean, and also there's a kind of polarization as well. I mean, if you look at like pensions, men get higher pensions than women, but also there's also a lot of poor older men, and of course the issues of embodiment and death and so on. Obviously,
there's also stuff about
activism
and passivity as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I should say one of the reasons I got interested in age, whenever it was, mid-90s, early 90s actually, was because I got fed up with people writing about masculinity and then only talking about, 18 or 25-year-olds.
Sure.
Which is, I'm sorry, that's not the way it is all the time. We're not all rushing around,
Well, thank you so much for giving up your time when you're so busy to speak to us, and for all of the great work you've done over such a long period of time. It's greatly appreciated.
Yeah, thank you for your work as well, both of you as well. Mutual admiration, society.
And thanks from me, Jeff, too. Your work's been something of an inspiration over the years. So,
absolutely.
Thanks for what you've been doing.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Well, Sandy, we've just had a little break. I've just had a very nice vegan cinnamon bun, which you very kindly got me from a local. Is it a social enterprise? Tap Social?
It is, I think. Yeah, Tap Social. Yeah. It's getting really quite well known, and they've employed many ex-offenders.
Right. Right.
They're actually very interesting in their
and that's here
their
in
method.
Oxford.
And there was an article about them in the paper just this weekend, and I think it said that 6% had reoffended, whereas of course the figures for those who come out and don't have something like this, this to go to, are way higher than that. And some of them talked in very sort of moving terms about what making vegan cinnamon buns has done for them.
Yeah. Well, it was a very tasty bun. But anyway, that's a side issue. That was, that was just a very small insight, really, into the huge gamut of issues that Jeff has researched over the course of his career, which is really quite something to behold. But it was a very interesting conversation. So, what did you make of it, Sandy?
Yeah, I feel, if we'd pressed certain other buttons, we would have got a whole load of very different and equally fascinating stuff. But
yes.
One thing that I was interested in was right at the start when he was talking about Trump and Biden. What I expected him to say, and maybe it was so obvious that he didn't, was to compare what is seen as the strength of Trump and the weakness of Biden. And in political discourse, strength is seen as an important characteristic, particularly for male leaders. You've got to be strong. And you can think about the Erdogans and Bolsonaros and all of this, and they're strong leaders. And actually, that should probably be contested. And I remember reading a book. It was probably a decade ago now, called "The Myth of the Strong Leader" by Archie Brown, a political scientist here in Oxford. And he was arguing, that actually collective leadership is really, really important, and you can get better decisions out of collective leadership than you can from, individuals who tend towards the more dictatorial or authoritarian. And I feel that we've kind of lost sight of some of that. But having said that, in the UK, people talk about the leadership of Prime Minister like Attlee after the Second World War, and how so many important things in political life and institutional life in the UK, the health service, nationalisation, all this came about as a result of Attlee's collective leadership.
That's true.
And in recent years we've had these charismatic figures, and I'm not sure it's done us any good at all, frankly.
Absolutely. I would
anyway,
agree with
so that was one thing that occurred to me, and I was also very interested generally in what he had to say about the work with older men and the memory work group. And the whole notion there, again going back to Trump and Biden, of sort of the expectation of men being powerful, being in control, and yet as you age, there's this diminishing, and weakness and vulnerability and all those things. How do men deal with those issues? And yet also at the same time, I mean, he mentioned David Jackson, who I think is a very interesting writer, and he wrote about how men in older age can also be activists as well. When they've got time to contribute, and they can be active grandfathers too, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a lot going on there around older masculinity, I guess. And I think that's an area that, as Jeff said, could be expanded further. So
well, and it's interesting, isn't it, that like in terms of the whole idea of strength versus weakness, because of course Trump is only a few years younger than Biden. But also, that, I mean, of course, it's not just about physical strength, is it? But also psychologically, perhaps, as well. And this idea that men should be rational, and perhaps that Biden is seen as failing in terms of masculinity in that respect. But I think something as well, which I thought about during the conversation was, I've lived in Finland for a few years, and Jeff's lived there for many years. And so, when he was comparing different approaches across Europe, because it's something that's just come up a lot in Australia recently, is thinking about the prevention of violence against women, and how, I guess, this idea that, in order to prevent it, we need to build more gender equality. But then, there's this idea of this Nordic paradox, that in countries like Finland, they've, got relatively higher levels of gender equality and yet still have higher levels of violence against women. So, that's been brought in to kind of challenge this idea that our gender equality is what we need. But I think, as kind of Jeff was perhaps alluding to, the things are quite complex, right? That these gender inequality plays out in all sorts of complicated ways, and that, in some ways, in the Nordic countries, they are doing quite well with things like employment or representation of women in politics. But actually, there's all sorts of different levels to it, and actually, you still can see, quite rigid, restrictive ideas of masculinity playing out, for example.
It was also, it was interesting in terms of, his analysis or exploration, shall we say, of what violence actually amounts to.
Absolutely,
and the connections between different forms of violence. That plays to your work as well. You mentioned, environmentalism and violence.
That's what I've been looking at for the last few years, really, is thinking about, how does things like kind of violence and destruction of the environment, how does that perhaps create the conditions for other kinds of violence and harm to flourish as well? Because, as Jeff said, these things do often seem to be interconnected. Like, we do see higher levels of violence against women in the wake of, like, natural disasters and things like that, which the climate crisis is obviously contributing to. So I think it is really interesting to think about how these different kinds of harm, also things like militarism and war that Jeff spoke about, how these things kind of feed into each other and can create the conditions for different kinds of quite patriarchal, dominating and harmful ways of being can kind of flourish in those settings.
I was reflecting on that as well, and thinking, certainly in the UK context, it feels like at the sort of micro level, there is some recognition of that. If you think about legislation around coercive control, that is partly about, what happened before the violent incident, after the violent incident, or maybe no specific violent incident. It's about a pattern of behaviour, isn't it?
Absolutely,
it seems quite important that that's now recognised as part of the violence.
Kind of continuum and how it connects, because I guess historically we've always thought about violence as just being these discrete incidents, when in reality, as Jeff said, it's a lot more complex and kind of ongoing than that, isn't it?
Indeed.
Well, that's probably enough for today, though, Sandy. Thank you again for the cinnamon bun and for the great conversation. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon. Do contact us at nowmen@gmail.com if you have questions or comments. And subscribe if you haven't done so already, wherever you get your podcasts. And yeah, take care of yourselves.
Yeah, and look forward to speaking to you again.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much. Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.